Hey guys, the following podcast is a Lady Gang Network and Podcast One production, which means it's going to be awesome.
Port is the mobile banking solution that believes your hard-earned money should work just as hard for you. Port members earn more with up to 3% annual percentage yield with their savings account. That's up to 40 times the national average. Yeah, money. Port members learn more through the app features like monthly spending tracker and true debt calculator that helps members monitor their spending and show how simple changes can help reduce debt and save money. To learn more, visit Port with an E. That's P-O-R-T-E banking.com. Port, your financial door to more. Interest paid on an average daily balance of $15,000 or less is 2.97% with an annual percentage yield of 3%, and the interest rate paid on the portion of the average daily balance exceeding $15,000 will be 0.49% with an APY for this tier between 3% and 0.5%. Rates good as of 5/1/2021. Port is a deposit account established with Meta Bank National Association, member of the FDIC.
Look, staying healthy isn't easy. Watching your diet, hitting the gym, avoiding stress. But a good night's rest helps boost your overall health and wellness. And it couldn't be easier. The new Sleep Number 360 Smart Bed is the only bed that effortlessly adjusts and responds to both of you. The result? You wake up ready for anything. Proven quality sleep is life-changing sleep. Don't miss our 4th of July special. The new Queen Sleep Number 360 C2 Smart Bed is only $8.99. Plus free premium delivery when you add a base. Ends Monday. To learn more, go to sleepnumber.com.
Welcome to The Stacks, a podcast about books and the people who read them. I'm your host, Tracy Thomas, and it is The Stacks Book Club Day. The wonderful Michael Denzel Smith, author of Stakes is High, is back to help us break down our June book club pick. It's The Undying, a meditation on modern illness by Anne Boyer. We talk today about the cancer industrial complex, the sexism associated with breast cancer, and the ways that form and content can work together or be at odds with one another in storytelling. There are no spoilers on today's episode. Be sure to listen all the way until the end of the show to hear our July book club pick. Are you looking for a way to support the work of the Stacks? Well, I have just the thing for you. It's called Patreon. It's a website that lets you contribute monthly to my work and in turn earn my unending gratitude and inside access to this show. For just $5 a month, the cost of one very fancy coffee, you have access to our monthly virtual book clubs where we all get together and talk about our Stacks book club pick. You also earn shoutouts on the show, discounts on merch, and mostly you get to know that your money is making the show possible every single week. So come join the Stacks Pack at patreon.com/thestacks. I'd like to give a special thank you to our newest members, Marianne Murphy, Valerie Schneider, Natalie Aiken, Allison Pfeffer, Ezra Rahima, Jill Ford, Jacqueline Ballantyne, Mary Monslav, Melissa Nix, and Frances Node. Thank you all so much for your generosity. Okay, now it's time for my conversation with Michael Denzel Smith about The Undying by Anne Boyer. All right, everybody, it is the Stacks Book Club Day. I am back with the wonderful Michael Denzel Smith. Michael, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me again.
I'm so happy you're here, especially to talk about The Undying
Yes.
by Anne Boyer that you picked. So usually I go back and forth with authors on the book, but you said you wanted to do this, and I did a quick Google search, and I was like, yes, we're going to do it. And I didn't know like anything else, and I'm really glad you picked it. I guess let's start there. What made you think this would be a good book for book club?
So I think I bought the book as so many of us do. We like buy a book when it first comes out or we first hear about it, and then it sits for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the problem of every sort of book nerd is you have way too many books in the to be read pile
Yes.
to actually get to. And then it like won the Pulitzer, and I was still like, oh yeah, I need to read that. And like I'd heard so many amazing things about it. But then I finally, some advice I got from a friend when I started teaching was to assign at least one book per semester that you want to read but haven't gotten around to, so it'll make you read it. And so I, this past semester, assigned to my students The Undying, and we read it, and then you and I were talking about, you know, book club and all of that. It's like, oh, well, I just read The Undying, so that'll be easy. And And I think part of the reason, though, is not just like laziness and being like, oh, that's a book that I just read, but the impact that it then had on me and sort of thinking through a lot of stuff that I've just not thought about or taken for granted. The book it's a memoir of Anne Boyer's diagnosis and treatment and living through breast cancer, which she positions herself in the very beginning in the sort of literary canon of breast cancer memoirs and journals alongside like a Susan Sontag or an Audre Lorde. But what she's really doing here in telling this story is an expose in a number of ways of the breast cancer industry, right? Like, and like giving us an idea of it as its own industry, not just from, the medical health side, but also the non-profit world that crops up around it, and the faux activism that happens around breast cancer. And from the beginning all the way through her examination of these institutions, one, there's just this building rage at the systems at play, and a forced examination on the part of the reader, I think, because of the position that breast cancer sort of occupies within the collective imagination, where, and Boyer gets at this, the pinkwashing of it, right? The idea of the valiant breast cancer survivor, of, the very language around that we use around fighting breast cancer, and like warriors and all of this stuff. And the forgetting, or the not even forgetting, but unacknowledgement or casting aside the humanity of the people who are experiencing it, and the idea that they do experience it, and their experiences don't fit the neat narrative that we have around exactly what I just described. This sort of like, oh yeah, I'm a tough woman because it mostly affects women. But that, there's a community that like rallies behind it. And then, every October you can see stuff like the NFL wearing pink and all.
God, such an eye roll.
Seriously. But, what about the experience of someone who lives through it, lives through the diagnosis, lives through the isolation, lives through the deterioration of relationships, or, just basic human desires for touch and love and all of that? And then what effects do the treatments have on your body? What are you thinking about if you learn, like Boyer does, and we can get into all of this, the environmental impacts of the treatment that you're receiving, the like financial cost. And then on the other side of it, when you do survive, how you're forgotten, right? And how, unless you sort of like mold yourself into the perfect survivor that then is like touted around and put into the nonprofit industry as a mascot and emblem of everything that they've wanted to sell to people in order to keep the nonprofit industry going. There's just so much here that I think, in terms of my own work and my own sort of attractions to different work, it's like, what systems do we live under, and how are those systems failing us? And this is, is very particular to the breast cancer survivors and patients. But I think, we're able to extrapolate out and just sort of think about all of the things in which all of the narratives that we tell, particularly around illness, and wondering, like, what are the effects on the people that actually go through it?
Right. Well, thank you all for listening. Michael just did the entire book in like 5 minutes, and that was an amazing episode of the podcast. I'm going to go take a nap. No, I mean, you really touched on like all of the things I want to talk about today in detail. Mm-hmm. This is sort of more of a cursory question, but I always ask people this. Generally, what did you think of the book?
It was a little slow going, honestly, in the beginning of the book.
Yes.
I wasn't taken by it initially. It took me a while to sort of see exactly where Boyer was going in the way that she was building the narrative, right? I jumped into it. What I'd heard so much of was just like Boyer's command of language and like being really amazing on the sentence level. And I wasn't getting a whole lot of that at the start.
Mm-hmm.
But what I liked about it later and then sort of loved about it afterward is one, the construction of it. She's sort of building this crescendo of anger, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it sort of drops off and then becomes a little more formally inventive. She's a poet, and then she's sort of like playing with that.
Right.
And then also at the end, kind of walking you through the writing process. I mean, she does that throughout the book, but there's a lot there in terms of like, what does it mean to be writing a memoir? What does it mean to be writing through the pain, writing through and like the fog of her own sense of like, of her own brain, as she's attempting to make sense and make meaning out of all of this. And then also do this critique of an industry that doesn't come under much scrutiny. So I think there were so many different elements at play that like you have to give it a little time to build, and you have to have a little patience, or maybe it grasps you and at the outset.
Didn't. I really struggled with. It's interesting because in the epilogue, she has this part where she's like, if this book is successful in any way, it will be because of who I am and what I went through and being a survivor, and it will have nothing to do with the form of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And that line really stuck out to me because I struggled so much with the form. I actually don't think that the form was the best part of the book. And I think she was kind of saying that in a way that maybe she felt like the form was great and like she was proud of kind of, because it's kind of funky. Like it's like these almost like vignettes on a topic. And so to me, I just couldn't get into it. And so I eventually switched to the audiobook actually, because I was really struggling with focusing and like wanting to keep reading it off the page. And the audiobook really helped, but I do think I missed some things because when I was going back to prepare for this, I was like trying to find sections and I was like, I don't remember that sentence at all. Like, I don't remember that. But the content I think was extraordinary. I mean, you laid out so much of what's impressive about the book, and it's a short book. And because the form, there's even less words than a normal 250-page book or whatever. Like there's not that much text. Like she really crams a lot in. And what I found to be really impressive is that the book is highly emotional. Like I think she's tapping into the, not emotional, like hysterical woman, but I mean emotional, like she's tapping into the reader's emotions, and she's tapping into the different feelings of what she's going through, but she's also bringing like data and dates and history, and she's also bringing art. And so for the sheer amount of tech richness in the text for such few words and for so few pages, like that was really impressive to me. And I also really liked the way that she led me to question the way that we do things that really don't make sense, that I'd never stopped to think about. And I think some of that is like, I don't know if you listened to the episode of the Ezra Klein show with Tressie McMillan Cottom.
Yes.
And they talk about how like disability, it's not a matter of if you're going to be disabled, but when. And that kept coming in through my mind as I was reading this, and the privileges that I've had of being a healthy, able-bodied person so far in my life, that I didn't have to think about a lot of these things. And I kept being like, fuck, I am not a good, like I'm not that I'm an ally, but like that I'm not even considering the ways that other people navigate the world because of the privileges that I hold in that world, in the world of disability and health. Like I've been so lucky and I'm so grateful. But when she was talking about like getting dressed up and like wanting to be the best dressed person at chemotherapy, like I could relate to that. Of course that would be me if I ever went to like I would be like, oh, I'm gonna shower and like put on makeup, but that's just not something that I've ever had to think about. And so I really appreciated that part of the book, that there were so many things she made me at least take my brain to, even for 30 words, and to be like, ooh, we need to think about that.
Yeah. The line between being a healthy person and sick person is so much thinner than most of us want to think about. And that, exactly what you were saying about the conversation between Ezra Klein and Tressie McMillan Cottom, it's, we think of these things as fixed categories, and we don't think of ourselves as the potential sick person, right? And that we can identify a sick person and then we can treat them as such, as if that's the only part of their existence. And when you then created whole industry around that idea, then you are ignoring a lot of the things that a sick person is telling you about their own emotional state, about their own physical state, because you're fixated on the idea that this person has always been this, and then they become an unreliable narrator. And so what Anne Boyer is doing here is saying, look, I know you think that I'm an unreliable narrator. I'm telling you the reasons why you think that I'm an unreliable narrator, and truly breaking down that psychology and like you're saying, the intellectual scope of this is massive. Within the few words that she's able to cram into all that. I'm curious what in terms of formally, what didn't work for you?
I think it was too disjointed in the beginning. And so I just couldn't figure out what was happening. And so I would get distracted. I'm a super easily distracted reader. And so if something isn't flowing and I'm not curious about the next page, I will check my phone 7,000 times in 6 pages. Do you know what I mean? I just couldn't quite. In the beginning, it starts off with the stuff about Susan Sontag, and her language is heightened. She's she's not writing. It's not like journal entries like, "Dear Diary, what's up? I read Susan Sontag." It's like the movement of Sontag's cursive. And I'm like, bitch, I don't know what that is. And so I think that is what made me struggle. And also there's the paragraph breaks. And then there's also the page breaks. And so when I was looking at it on the page, I couldn't quite figure out what was happening, because usually those things are cues to me when I'm reading prose. And it's probably because she is a poet and they play so much with form on the page that she was doing that same thing in her prose. But I think it was confusing me a little bit.
Yeah, no, I get that. I totally, because that was an issue I think I was having in sort of placing everything. And I think that it was, but eventually I think what I got was, yes, she was playing in the beginning and doing those things, but that a large chunk of the book is a sort of linear narrative, right? It just moves through, I was diagnosed, then I was treated, and then this is the post-treatment, all of that, and the dealings with, her financial situation, her employment situation, all of this stuff. And I think, that then Lynn, drops off and she's done telling the story, that, is imbued with all of her anger. And then she then she starts doing a little more even with the form, and I think that the second half of that, or last third of it or so, is even more so out there in terms of being disjointed and not necessarily following anything from a point A to point B. I think where I came to was in the beginning this was difficult to follow because it felt like there were digressions that into an art criticism, and then that felt like, I'm not placing how these are related to one another. But then when it all came together, it was what I felt like I was experiencing was not just the story of her breast cancer and breast cancer survival, but what it was like for her to go through the fog, right?
Yeah.
And that the form is reflective of her own emotional and intellectual state at the time. Yeah. Whereas things would come in pieces, and that's how she had to be able to think through it.
Yeah, I think that that's right. I do think that what she was trying to do was to show sort of the disjointed nature of having such a terrifying diagnosis and all of those things. Because, I mean, she was diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer.
Yeah.
And I think there were some other qualifying terms around that, but a very, very aggressive form of breast cancer that kills women or people who get it. The younger they are, the more they die from it. And she was 41. And so I think that there's definitely like the trauma of that shocking diagnosis. And I mean, she says like with cancer, I can't remember the exact quote, but she's talking about how it's like you only feel sick once you get the diagnosis, but the day before you felt totally fine,
right?
You know, unless it's gotten really bad and it's gotten bad enough for you to go in because you feel sick, but like that the tumor was there, and then when you find out about it, all of a sudden the tumor hurts, you know, and I like, and I think that is definitely sort of what is happening in the form, that she's like breaking it down to these like, oh, this reminds me of an art piece I saw. Speaking of art pieces, like that other book that I read. But for me as a reader, it didn't work in execution as much as it works in theory. Like I appreciate what she did, but I was like, I'm not getting this.
Yeah.
Which is why when I switched to audio, it was a little bit better because, you know, the reader takes a pause, but the reader doesn't take a pause that's like so long that I know it's a paragraph break or whatever, unless it's like a big one. And so that helped me to feel the flow of more like almost like stream of consciousness, not exactly, but like that same kind of vibe. And speaking of what you said, when people told you about the book, that like the sentences and all of that stuff were so great. I mean, some of the sentences in this book are insanely incredible. Like, and like the word choice. And I think that also probably comes from her being a poet. I feel like poets and word choice, like that's a huge part of the puzzle.
Absolutely.
But she has this sentence that when she's talking about, it's super short, but she's talking about in regards to the pain scale, like giving a number. And she says, sensation is the enemy of quantification. And I remember I heard that and I had to pause and like rewind it and then write it down. Cause I was like, wow, I don't know. Those words all make so much sense together. And like she also does like some cool list stuff, like when she lists all the different ways, all the different things she's going to do with her hair when it falls off, and like sending her eyelashes to her enemies, and like so like some of that stuff was really cool, and it seemed like she was enjoying playing with the form for sure.
Definitely. I think there's a lot of sentences that I was impressed by, but I think also one of the things that really stuck out to me is when she's sort of describing going into that room where all of the other chemo patients are, and exactly that moment that you're talking about with regard to like quantifying her pain, and everyone's sort of like trying to tell how much it actually hurts, and they're being told that no, it's not
with the needle, with the big needle.
And what she does there though is she never actually attempts to describe the pain itself. Like she resists metaphor or simile or anything that we would be, I think a lot of us are accustomed to. She only describes the process, and she only describes exactly what's happening there. And I think that like a lot of that is her admission or sort of grappling with the fact that like you can't really describe pain to people and like make them understand it. Like you go through it, but language fails you. Like you think that you're like capturing something that's relatable to an audience, whether they be listening to you or reading your work, but everyone has their own different markers for what that experience might be. And she's very concise and deliberate in just sort of like saying, this is just what happens. And so you can read into it yourself, like, what would my reaction to that be? And how painful might that experience be for me? And I think that placing a reader in that position was really masterful to me, in that like she resists sensationalizing, as she does so much of the book, and just sort of being like, I'm not trying to convince you of the amount of pain that I was in. I'm just saying that you wouldn't listen even if I attempted to.
Right. Well, she also says in that section about how people tell you you can't communicate pain, or like that pain is like that's something that you experience but you can't communicate it. And then she goes on to say, except for that we do all the time. Like if someone pinches you, you grimace, and we all understand what that grimace looks like. And there are ways to communicate pain that we all know, but that there's some sort of unwillingness to appreciate or understand or empathize with a cancer patient's pain for some other reason, right? She doesn't necessarily say exactly why that is, but that is part of like the language of cancer is like, oh, we can't quantify pain except for with these numbers. Like we can't talk about it in any way except for on a scale of 1 to 10, even though we all communicate pain constantly. And if you walk past someone who's in pain, or if someone stubs their toe, that there's pain, but like that this kind of pain we don't want to empathize with or engage with in any sort of meaningful way. And I think, like, to me, one of the big takeaways from the book is how much healthy people suck in relationship to people who are sick. Like that was one of the things that I felt like, at least that's what I felt like I was being told over and over. Like an example is that same pain thing. It's like the doctors don't want to find a different way to have these conversations. It's like, no, or the nurses in this case, like, no, the needle doesn't hurt. Like, okay, well, I'm telling you it does. And it's my arm and that needle's big and it's hurting me. And you're poking
It's like, have you had this needle before?
Right.
Did you tell anyone
right.
that?
Exactly. And it's like, and I just like the language, I mean, we definitely have to talk about sort of the language around quote unquote fighting cancer. And for folks who have listened to this show before, we did The Unwinding of the Miracle by Julia Williams, I believe was her last name. And she had stage 4 colon cancer and she ended up dying. So it's like a death memoir, and she was young. And we talked a lot on that episode about sort of the fighting of cancer and this like idea that the language of war and all of that stuff is like how we approach it. But what Anne Boyer does in this book is I feel like she complicates that sort of, I feel like I've heard that before from other people, but I feel like she added a lot to the language of cancer. Like she was talking not just about fighting it, but like the things that are like, you mess with the wrong bitch and like all of that kind of stuff, like kind of tongue in cheek, and like, I'm too hot for cancer, and like I like just put on your lipstick or go dance it out, and like all this shit. And I think Anne Boyer says, except for in my case, cancer picked the right bitch. It's like, thank you, Anne. But like that like your attitude or that your mindset is actually relevant to the cancer. That's not to say that it might not be relevant to you, the patient. Like you might feel like I do better going to get chemo if I'm going in feeling really fucking positive, and that might very well help you. But just because someone feels negative doesn't mean that the chemo doesn't work for them, right? Like that the science of it and then the emotional part of it are different, but we're being told and taught, and we're telling people, you're only going to get through this if you're positive. Like you're only going to get through this if you smile and put on a wig and look hot and pretend like your boob doesn't have a tumor in it, and like all this stuff that's like, it's kind of sexist.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things, because it's one, just the sort of like the idea of, again, this very American rugged individualism, right? Like you take it on by yourself. It is your illness. It's not a community thing, right? Like it's not a failure of institutions. It's not something that like we all need to pitch in and care for. It's like, no, if you fight it, what if I'm someone like an Anne Boyer who is a single mother with the single income that still needs to provide and all of that, and like what does that mean, right? Like how do I find a village to be able to care for me if everyone is thinking, no, The real thing is just how you approach it, the mindset. And then it's also because of the particulars of the disease, it does the majority of people who are dealing with breast cancer, just by numbers and the reporting sort of who it is cis women. Not to say no one else ever experiences breast cancer. Obviously, it cuts across gender. But because it has become such a cis women's disease, right? There's also the expectation of the continued performance of femininity throughout all of it, right? And so now you're not just charged with fighting the disease, but ensuring that you never fail in your womanhood, right? That you maintain that, because it is a direct attack on something that, you know, a secondary sex characteristic that's supposed to define womanhood. Like, and so you gotta fight it, because otherwise you're no longer a woman, and then you will no longer be welcome into this club, and we will no longer have to respect you in the, you know, very limited way that women are respected.
And even on top of that, I'm just thinking, as you're saying, like, there are other cancers that affect women and people with ovaries, vaginas, with those sex organs, like ovarian cancer or uterine cancer or vaginal cancer, but those cancers aren't treated in the same way. And I think part of it is because breasts are a physical outward attribute of women and femininity in a way that an ovary or a cervix isn't. Like, you don't see my cervix every day when I walk down the street. Yeah. And like, there's not a sexualization of a uterine lining, but like the breast is a physical, you know, it's like, oh, that's the thing that you see that makes a woman a woman. And so, and it is so interesting, because there are like men cancers, right? Like prostate cancer. You can get it if you're not a man, or if you're not a cis man, but we don't patronize men. We don't tell men who have prostate cancer to go ride a horse or something, you know, like, we're not like, hey, go smoke a cigar, like do whatever men do. Like, you know, and it's just like, it's so sexist. Is there a term for when something, I guess, like heteronormative sexist? Is that
cis-sexist?
Cis-sexist. Like, it's so, you know, it just like plays into all the gendered bullshit. Like, get a pink wig and like do your makeup and like, let's go out. And like also the reconstruction part of it. That like women who have mastectomies feel like they have to get their breasts put back on. And some women probably want to and feel like that is a part of their identity that they want. But I also wonder if the pressure to do it, if that wasn't there, how many women would go through additional surgeries to have their breasts reconfigured?
Yeah. If part of your identity is wrapped up in like a sexist vision of what femininity and womanhood looks like, but you also then receive attention and validation for the meeting and performance of those values, and then one aspect of that is taken away, would you not want to reclaim it? Would you not want to, like, because you're fearful that then like you're going to be forgotten, discarded, you know, all of these things. And so you're like, no, I need to hold on to some part of this, because I will lose the sense of self that I've built here. And that not only that, I will be further devalued, that I will be a woman with that is not truly a woman, because I lack this one physical characteristic. And that, you know, that also lends itself to a number of ways in which, like I say, cis-sexist, it's because we're defining womanhood by the existence of like round breast that we identify with, like breastfeeding, but like also the sexualizing of the breast, and saying that, oh, that's the path toward womanhood. Well, if you are a trans woman who has not gotten breast augmentation, then you're not a true woman, right? Like,
Right.
but even if you do, then you're still not, because of the other physical characteristics that we've said are the only definition of womanhood. And so now you've got everyone in a tangle trying to
Right.
like, go through this and meet expectation, but you're doing this in this particular instance to someone who has gone through a physical trauma in
Right.
breast cancer.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's fucked up.
It's totally fucked up.
It's so fucked up. And I just want to say, because I'm not sure if what I said before sounds like I was saying something that I'm not saying. So I just want to be very clear. I'm not saying anything disparaging against any woman who decides to do anything to their body and their breasts, whether they have cancer or not. That's not what my point is. My point is more that there is a pressure that is applied to women who maybe don't want to, but feel like they need to. But if you want to, please do whatever the fuck you want with your own body, as long as it doesn't hurt someone else. I just want to be very clear. Because that's just, I don't have opinions about what people do in that way. Let's take a quick break and then we'll be back. You hear me talk about Libro FM almost every week on this podcast. It's because I love them. They offer a great selection of audiobooks, and every purchase you make goes towards supporting an independent bookstore of your choosing. It's a win-win. Libro FM also keeps it fun and fresh by featuring a variety of audiobooks from bestsellers and new releases to recommendations from your favorite authors. They even let me make a playlist. So go check them out. Plus, if you're new to Libro FM, you can get 2 audiobooks for the price of 1 when you use the code THESTACKS at checkout. So head to Libro.fm and use the code THESTACKS, all one word, at checkout to get 2 audiobooks for the price of 1. We were kind of just before talking about the sexism of breast cancer. And one of the things that she talked about is sort of, she very quickly kind of sprinkled some words over it, was the racism of especially the kind of breast cancer she had, this triple negative, which proportionately affects Black women. And there's 2 different parts of the book where she sort of glosses over this. And one part is where she talks about how single women are twice as likely to die from breast cancer as married women, in all without any other factors being included. But for me as a Black woman, I couldn't help but think that the singleness of Black women is a factor in and of itself, because Black women are the most likely to be single of women. So I found that for her to kind of like say, like, without taking in any other factors, I'm like, yeah, but even that sample size is going to be disproportionately Black, because Black women make up more single people. And then later she talked about how part of the reason that she thinks that triple negative has the least options for treatment and is because it disproportionately affects Black women. And I found that to be interesting, and I'm glad that she said that. But the 2 times that she kind of brought it up, I felt like she didn't really engage with that part of it. And of course, that's not her experience, but I feel like other things she went deeper, and I was sort of like, come on, Anne, like, say it. Just say it.
No, it's one of the biggest disappointments of the book is that she very clearly has an understanding and an acknowledgement of the disproportionate impact on Black women, but refuses to sort of like engage it with the same intellectual rigor that she does the rest of her own experience. And, you'd be like, oh, but it is still the memoir form, and so it's much about her experience, and that's fine, except that what she's doing so much of is using the personal experience as a launch pad for an institutional critique.
Exactly.
And when that institutional critique only bears glancing mention to the level of racism at play and like doesn't account for her experience as a white woman and the attendant privileges, like even as she's trying to like show us like, look, this is actual breast cancer, like this is the actual, or this is at least one narrative that doesn't fit into the mold of the breast cancer narratives that have been trotted out and praised publicly, well, what it doesn't account for, or doesn't really attempt to account for, is that her narrative is still subject to and buttressed by her whiteness, and she doesn't really do enough work there to feel like, okay, you've given all of your sort of intellectual weight to this question as well.
Right. And I think that like the omission of Black women or Latinx women or any other racial group, and I would say also trans people, I think the choice to not include them, we have to consider that a choice that she made because she includes so much stuff that's outside of her own personal scope and experience. And she goes out of her way, you kind of in the hoax section, to talk about other women, those other women's experience via the YouTube videos. And there's never really, I don't believe, there might be one mention, but I'm pretty sure that, when she's in the chemo room, there's never a mention of the racial breakdown or demographic of those people. There's no engagement with race. And when she admits that her kind of cancer is most found in Black women, to me, that's a choice. Like it's not like she had to go reach out further than the kind of cancer that she had or reach out to anything outside of what she was experiencing. And, it's a bummer.
Yeah. It's a choice that, seems to be not in line. What I can see in the decision making there is saying essentially, look, I know that all of this exists and that I would love to do all of that work, but there's also this primary mission that is the attack on these institutions and this narrative, and that I have to do the breaking of that narrative here and leave the rest to someone else. That like hopefully this book is sort of like the first shot into that, and that like this opens a space for the proliferation of more of these kinds of narratives rather than the accepted nonprofit corporatized narratives of breast cancer survival. And so I can understand from the craft perspective, in sort of political mission of like doing the first shot to be able to do that. But what it then signals is a lack of, or an unwillingness to consider that those Black women aren't necessarily going to get the same opportunity to do this kind of work and tell this kind of story.
And also, her experience of being seen as a victim or a survivor and all of those things, that's directly related to the ways that Black women aren't afforded those opportunities, right? Aren't afforded the sympathy of being a cancer patient. Like when we see Susan G. Komen walk for the cure, like whatever, it's so rarely that there's a Black woman who's the face of that. It's usually some young, pretty blonde lady. And like, but she is directly in relationship to that, And so I think that the choice to not include it, well, I understand exactly what you're saying, is it's like not every memoir can do everything and not every book can do everything, and she's making space for someone else to do it. I do think that in the way that she interrogates the other institutions, she has to interrogate the racism of it because it's clearly at play, and she hints at it. She kind of like coyly like throws it in. And I don't know that people who are reading her book who aren't necessarily as interested in racism as you and I obviously are gonna be seeing those few sentences and being like, you didn't do it. Like I think other people might be like, oh, that's interesting. Black women have breast cancer. And let me go back to the beautiful artwork in the Netherlands.
Right. It's a missed opportunity because of who the audience, is going to be, is that like, look, that the people that she's speaking to right now with this book are not going to, are not as likely to tune in and pick up the book from the Black woman who does exactly the same work that Ann Boyer is doing, but also does the critique of the racism of these institutions. Like, they're not going to pick that up the same way. Like, there's the hope, obviously, that they would, but it's not going to land the same way as if Ann Boyer was doing that work here, which is speaking to, she knows exactly who's going to pick this up. It's going to be mostly white women who have consumed the narratives of breast cancer looking for another one, right? Like looking for another hopeful memoir around like how this all works, and like being like, oh, breast cancer warrior. And she is doing something deliberate in interrogating and excavating that narrative for all of its falsehoods and all of its all of its vulturistic qualities, but missing the racism where it's like, okay, if you can do the rest of this for them and you can do all of that work for them, don't leave them without that aspect, because like, understand that this is going to be so shattering for them that they may not tune in the next time, especially if the person that's telling this story is a Black woman who they're primed not to listen to anyway.
Right. I was just thinking, as you were talking about Black women who have like famously had breast cancer, and aside from Audre Lorde, the only people that are really popping into my mind, and this is so sad, is like the mothers of professional athletes who they feature in October, where it's like, these like running backs, because it's football season and baseball doesn't have that many Black American players. But it's like, it's that those are the people that pop into my head. And that's really troubling, because when I think about like white celebrities, I mean, I can think of a few who have had breast cancer, like Louise Dreyfus, right? She had breast cancer. And then, we know that Angelina Jolie had the BRCA gene. And so she had preemptive surgery, I think prophylactic surgery. So it's just interesting because, of course, it not only affects Black women disproportionately, and she says in the book that they are diagnosed less and die more, but also that in mainstream media, entertainment circles where there's so much, awareness being brought up, it's like we're not seeing Black women.
Yeah. I mean, Audre Lorde's the only example that she can bring up when she's situating herself in the sort of literary lineage, right? Like, that's the only Black woman example. And like, if again, we're being subject to the singular narrative, and that exactly what you're saying, it's not as if we don't know the statistics at hand, but the face of breast cancer continues to be a white woman, in part because of like a lot of the things that we brought up earlier, where it's like, who is then the embodiment of societal's desired femininity? It is going to be white women, and if they are suffering, then therefore it must be a problem. But the people being diagnosed and dying from the most aggressive form of this breast cancer are disproportionately Black women, and yet there's no, until this book, really, like, I didn't even realize that was the case.
Me neither.
And so if there's a potential, like, credit to Ann Boyer because I didn't know that until she wrote it, but there's the potential then for a further exploration. And I'm not saying that it's on Ann Boyer's shoulders to bear that, but there's plenty more that could have been done in this book to address that and like to incorporate. I get it. It's memoir, but the incorporation, but she's also telling other people's stories.
Right. It's memoir, but she's already broken the rule of she can't hide behind that because of what else she does in the book.
Yeah.
Like if she really told like a straight up memoir, it's like, I walked to the store and this is what I did, then maybe I'd be like, okay, I get it. But she's doing more than just memoir. And this sort of ties into this conversation of racism, sexism, which is the part about care, where she talks about how the people who are employed to give care are so often underpaid because it's looked at as like women's work, but they're the people who are telling you a joke while they're also, you know, trained to stick a needle in your arm, and they're collecting all the data and they're doing the math and the science behind it while they're also like changing your bedpan. And that there's so like, it's about attention to detail and educating the patient and cleaning and all this stuff. And, you know, my husband is a doctor, and so I think a lot about nurses because I recognize how much of his job is what we think is done by doctors is done by nurses and physicians assistants and other people. Not to disparage doctors. They do a lot of great stuff and they, you know, whatever. But I think so much of the credit is given to doctors and not nurses. And I think about nurses all the time. And I think that this book, she really drives that home in such a clear way. And I mean, so many people who are in the care industry are people of color. I mean, in California, there's many Filipino nurses. I think there's at least in the hospitals that I know and that my husband's worked in, and a lot of Black women and Latina women. And I just think it's interesting. I mean, I'm not surprised, but it's you know, they're paid worse and they do more work and they're not respected. And that's the other part of it. It's like, fine, don't pay me as much, but like at least respect me. Like,
yeah. I mean, nice. I remember at the very beginning of, maybe not the very beginning, but it was at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was on this thing discussing sort of, you know, what the numbers were telling us, or it was disproportionately Black and Latinx and indigenous peoples that were contracting and then dying from COVID-19. And I was having this discussion with this doctor in the UK, and he's sort of trying to say, well, look, we have to look at these different factors to be like, what's the difference in why people are dying, and like having to look at like, I think so much of it was like about like vitamin D deficiency and all of this stuff. And then he was trying to say that you look within the hospitals, right? Like, why is it that the doctors aren't contracting the COVID at the same rate as the nurses? And it's like, well, one, they're in more contact with patients. But if you're trying to say that there's some difference in the nurses, the reason that more women of color are going into nursing than becoming doctors, you have to look at all of the different structural barriers therein, the ways in which nurse and care work has been feminized, the number of opportunities for even this low paying job, but like better paying job than what many people from these communities would experience, and then why that would mean a disproportionate flood of women of color into this profession. And so it was just baffling to me for him to be like, well, there's got to be something wrong with them,
like
if
genetically.
Like, you know.
That's, I mean, the way that people shit on nurses is just, it is really horrible. I just, anybody listening, be nice to the nurses, because truly they do everything, and the doctors do, like, I mean, no offense, husband, but nothing. Like, I had twins. My husband's an OB. I had twins. He's not my doctor. Everyone, don't ask. But I had twins, and my nurses were the fucking heroes. And my doctor was great, but like, you know. Anyways, not to show. I love doctors. It's just that
there's just a separation for so many people, and like within the hospital itself, where it's like, no, the nurses do the care work, and and the doctors do the intellectual work.
Yeah, they do like the medicine work,
right? And so therefore, that's more valued, not just because like you think of it as having more value, but because of who is performing,
who's doing it, and who decides what's valuable. Exactly. And the other thing that she talked about care that I had truly never thought about, not even for 1 second, I had never had this. We are not given any time off to care for anyone that we're not related to. And like directly related to. Like, you don't get medical leave to take care of your aunt. You
No.
get it for your mom or maybe your spouse or your child, but you don't get it for your sibling. You can't take
No.
it for you can't take it for your best friend. You can't take it for, and I think in a small way, I kind of had thought about this when it came to in like 2008 when the big issue of the Supreme Court of the time or in California was Prop 8, but for gay marriage. And I know that one of the reasons that it was important to people was because they wanted to be able to be in the room with their significant other during medicine and stuff. But I'd never thought about even like you can't take time off to take your partner to the hospital if they're not your husband or wife, you know?
Yeah.
And like, so that's the only way that I thought about it was in that one context. But in an even bigger context, like you can't take time off to take your best friend or cousin or coworker who lives alone and is disabled or whatever. Like we know that, I mean, I don't even think we have to spend too much time on the American medical system because we all know that like health insurance and all of that shit is fucked up and it's too expensive and like what a waste of time. But this part of it, this like, you can't even take care of people.
Right.
Like the most vulnerable people who are ill and alone, there's no way to even help them if you too are not super financially stable. If you have a job, you know, you have to choose between taking your next door neighbor who needs help to the doctor to get their COVID vaccine, whatever it is. You have to choose between that and getting written up at work. Like that shit's so fucked up.
Yeah. And then it's incredibly fucked up, and exactly what she's sort of pointing to in terms of like who dies the most from this, and being single women who are diagnosed with breast cancer, is because there is no one who's able to care for them. There's no one that's able to show up, and that the primacy of, I mean, now we can say like marriage across the board, but like it really truly still remains the sort of hetero marriage as the family unit, but then it's also the care unit. It's the only people that you're supposed to rely on are the two people that are in this single unit, and that the idea that all of that be foisted on one person's shoulders and then not account for anybody who's not in one of those particular unions or is single or what have you, to say that no one's allowed to show up for you. Like, what is that message that you're saying? Like, no one is allowed to show up for you without great risk to their own livelihood.
Or just being wealthy. Like being able to, like, if you're not independently wealthy or able to be fine missing work, then if your friends aren't rich, basically you don't get help from your friends.
Yeah. And then what you're saying is not just that, like, physically you'll continue to deteriorate because of a lack of just like basic care on that level, but that means an isolation that means the furthering of depression and the anxiety that's going to be attendant with no matter what, you know, once you get that diagnosis. It means you don't have the emotional care that you need during this time because your people are scattered and you just don't have people in your immediate vicinity. No one's there to just talk to you and laugh and all of that stuff. Like, what? Yeah.
And like, because why? That's the thing. It's like, because I need to go to work and my boss needs to make as much money as possible.
Yes.
My employer, like, it's like, okay, but you know, if we go back to the Tressie Ezra thing, like you're going to be disabled one day too. You're going to be sick one day too. You're going to need help one day too. And it's so fucked. And like the thing that's even more fucked about it to me, at least, like as I selfishly look at myself, is like, I never thought about it. Like the system that's in place is so good at keeping us isolated and not relying and telling us like that we don't deserve to have community that I just never even thought about it. It never crossed my mind. And that's really horrible. Like, I think like the system is bad, but the fact that I'd never even questioned it is even worse.
It's not something that you really even think of until you're in that position, right? Like you just sort of and we don't want to think of ourselves as ever having to be in that position. It goes back to what you're saying in terms of the distinction that we make between a healthy person and a sick person. Most of us are going to want to think of ourselves in the healthy person category. And in that, we're never thinking about like, well, what if I become a sick person? Who would care for me? Who would I have to be able to show up in that way? And not thinking about the legal fact that like a person that you care for would not be able to, a person that you care for and cares for you would not be able to show up for you in the ways that you may need, because you don't have the right relationship to them. You don't have the right legal relationship to them. And that even if you did have a marriage to this person, now you're asking them to perform all of those duties.
Right. All of those duties. Exactly. Yeah. There's one more thing that I really want to touch on, because I think it was something else that was like mind blowing for me. But it was when she was talking about the hoax of cancer and like people pretending to have cancer so that they can have sympathy. It reminded me of, you know, the author AJ Finn / Dan Mallory, same person. He wrote The Women in the Window, the one that just became the movie with Amy Adams. Anyways, he lied about having brain cancer and all this stuff. There's like a great, I think it's the New Yorker article. It came out a few years ago about him.
Yeah.
But it's just like, I mean, he's a white guy, and I kept thinking, like, if you can't get ahead as a white guy in publishing, and he was an editor and all this, I'm like, you need to fake cancer to get sympathy? Like, then your shit's not that good, my guy. Like, you're already there.
White guys are desperate for like victim narratives. They really, truly are.
They love it. They eat that shit
really,
up.
Yeah.
But I'm just like, look, AJ Finn, like you already have a seat at the table. You're an editor at a major publisher. Like, anyways. Yeah. He was like doing it while he was like at Oxford or something horrible. But just the whole, like the section where she talks about, I can only remember one person's name, Coop Dizzle, but where she talks about the women with the like vlogs, like the YouTube videos and the people in the comments being like, you just need to drink alkaline water. And the woman's like already dead. Yeah. And they're commenting on these videos of women who are already dead from the cancer, and the whole like holistic and even the doctor side of it. Like the doctors being like, take this chemotherapy drug. And like, they don't even know for sure. And like, we can't just accept that we don't know. When it comes to treatment, we can't just accept that it's ever evolving. It has to be, no, this supplement works, or this chemo drug works. And it doesn't always work. No. Like, and we don't know. And I don't know. That part was very depressing.
Yeah. It's the cockiness, like the self-assuredness of all of the people, like, you know, to borrow sports metaphor, as we all do at times, like all the people on the bench just like thinking that they can call the plays because they're like, oh yeah, sure. Like, I've never actually gone through this, but I know because I read something on the internet one time, and like, or like, because I adopt a holistic, ethos and diet and all of this stuff, that like I've never been sick. And it's just like, look, understand that that's not going to prevent it. Like, you're not, that's not necessarily going to prevent it. Like, I hope for the best for you that's not going to be the case, that you become sick in this way. But you don't know what these other people have done. You don't know like how they've lived their lives. They may have lived the most healthy life as possible, but be subject to environmental factors that then contributed to their cancer diagnosis, and all of the different things that we find about the additives in our foods, and like whatever it is that we're not aware of, whatever it may be. But then there's an assuredness, because there's, again, like we were saying earlier, this sort of individualistic approach to it, that like, if you fix your behavior, then you can beat this. You can go about it. Know that that's like the spirit is within you, all of this stuff. And it's just like, well, what if we just like cared for the person when they were sick and gave them the things that they needed to be comfortable, and then hope that that they come out on the other side of it. Like,
right.
what
And
if we just did that?
Yeah, and accepted that people die from this thing, and that you're dying from this cancer or from anything isn't a moral failure on you.
No.
Like, it's not that you didn't try or you didn't want to live or that you were choosing death. It's none of those things. It's just that some people die, and sometimes people have to die from this horrible cancer, and sometimes people have to die from an accident. And like, you would never say that someone who got in a car accident wanted to die or they didn't try hard enough. It's like, this is part of life, and we're so scared of it. And it's a horrible way to go. I mean, like,
yeah.
And I would want to do everything that I could to make my life as comfortable and easy as possible if I were to be going through that. But like, people need to have the support and the comfort and also the grace to feel like shit if they want to, like, and the space,
right.
And like, doctors also need to have the humility to be like, I don't know.
Yeah.
This is the treatment that I've got right now. This is my best guess on how we can cure this thing. But like, Dr. Baby didn't give her the best treatment. Love Dr. Baby. Dr. Baby did not give her the best treatment. And it's not because Dr. Baby wasn't trying. It's because Dr. Baby doesn't know better than anyone else. And like,
right.
We're so obsessed with having to solve this problem. And it's like, we're not there yet, people. We're just not there yet.
We're not.
And like, it's so, I mean, that section was really difficult. And that section also was where they had the surgery that they said should have worked. And then they gave it to a bunch of women. And then a lot of them got really, really sick and it didn't work at all. And then the doctor, I think in South Africa, was like, oh yeah, about that. And they were like, that's a hoax. Sorry. Okay. We're basically out of time. But before we do the last little bit, was there anything else that you wanted to touch on or talk about that we didn't get to?
No, I think we got it.
I think we did pretty good. There might be a few things we forgot, but I feel like there's a lot.
Yeah.
We didn't really talk about the art, but honestly, that was my least favorite part.
No.
Like, I don't know, wasn't interesting. But I did look up a lot of the pictures.
I'm not an art critic, so
yeah, I was like, that looks sad. Okay, so we always kind of end around the title and the cover.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know which cover you had. I had the paperback with the snake on it. Okay,
it's
there's
the same for the hardcover,
Oh, because I saw another one that was different. Because so the title of mine is The Undying, and when I looked it up on the internet, one of the subtitles is A Meditation on Modern Illness, but the other subtitle I saw is The Undying, and then it's all these words down the side: The Undying, pain, vulnerability, mortality, medicine, art, blah blah blah. And I thought that was really interesting that there are different titles. Does yours have the Pulitzer sticker on it or no?
It does not have the Pulitzer sticker. I got it before
that.
Yeah.
Because I definitely was like, oh, there's two different subtitles, and that's a very interesting choice.
I didn't realize that because I hadn't seen the new subtitle because it took me a long time to realize all of these words on here were the subtitle.
Yes, same.
I have seen that before, where it's sort of like a book will come out in the hardcover with one subtitle, and then they change the subtitle for the paperback, maybe thinking that like people didn't get the first one the first time, that like there's more clarity the second time around, and that like that's part of like the failure of a book, and maybe if it didn't sell what people thought it was going to sell or whatever. I've seen that some like changing it to be a little more provocative because like the first time around it didn't. But I think that's probably my guess on this one would be that it just needed to be a little more concise because people didn't understand.
I think the one that I found was the first one.
Oh.
But I don't know. I only thought that because I have the paperback, but you're telling me, I don't know. Maybe it was like the British edition. I don't know. I was looking on bookshop.org. It's the long subtitle, but when I went on Amazon, they had a shorter subtitle for a hardcover. So maybe that was the British. I have no idea. Yeah. But I do like the title, The Undying, because at first I didn't understand it, but towards the end of the book, she said, now that I started my process of undying, and it made sense because I was thinking of it as like the undying, but she's saying it like the undying. No, I was sorry. I was thinking of it as the undying, but she's talking about it's the undying. No, I can't. I'm doing it wrong. Basically, I was thinking of it as like people who are undying, but she was talking about the process. She was talking about the verb of undying, and I was thinking of the noun of undying. I don't know.
No, yeah, but it's just like the idea of like being like, oh yeah, I had cancer and I was dying.
Mm-hmm.
It got cured to the extent that it can be cured, and now I'm living a life after that. Like I must be undying.
Yes,
like,
that's right. You did it right. Undying. It's the un. Yeah, I thought that I hadn't thought about it in that way until I got to the end of the book where she was like, and now that I'm undying, and I was like, oh,
yeah,
I'm so dumb.
Not at all.
But I do like the cover with the syringe and the snake and the like different amounts being the different words on the like scale, like the measuring inches or whatever.
I'm really into a book cover that's sort of just giving me what the book is.
Yes.
Like I don't want it to be too abstract or like I just want to know what it is that I'm getting into. And like here it is, The Undying by Anne Boyer, and then here we have all like this as the subtitle, like giving me exactly what the book has encapsulated here. And the artwork, you know, you can interpret all of these different ways, but really like you're looking at a syringe that you associate with that you'll associate with the medicine world, but you can also associate with drug use. But like this snake coiled around it lets me know that there's something fucked up about like what's happening that right. You know, I need to be wary of, that I need to examine further before like diving into what I think is supposed to be helpful.
And in medicine, the snake is like the emblem of medicine. I can't remember where it comes from, but they're like the snake is associated with like doctors. So like a lot of things will have like snakes on it for medicine. So I think it's a nod to that too. But yeah, I think the cover is really great. It's very straightforward. It's not a wow cover that I would necessarily grab off the shelf for it. But when I saw it, I was like, because again, I bought this book basically knowing nothing. And I was like, oh, okay, we're going to talk about medicine. Like, I was like, okay, I know what's up. Yeah, I think that's it. Anything else?
No, just this was wonderful to talk about it.
This was so great. Yeah. Thank you for talking with me about it. And everyone at home, you can get Michael's books. Invisible Man Got the Whole World Watching and Stakes is High. They're out in the world. Michael has a podcast called Open Forum, which is out in the world now too. Subscribe, rate, and review. Leave those reviews. We need those reviews, people. And everything we talked about will be in the show notes. I don't know. I feel like I feel like this was a very successful episode. We did all the things. I feel very like I have nothing else to say.
I feel great. Thank you, Tracy, so much for having me on.
You're welcome. Anytime. And everyone else, we will see you in the stacks. Thank you all so much for listening, and thank you to Michael for being my guest. Okay, now it's time for our July book club pick. It is The Best We Could Do by T. Bowie. It is our first ever graphic novel, and we will discuss the book on the podcast on July 28th. Tune in next week to find out who our guest will be. Please make sure you're subscribed to The Stacks wherever you get your podcasts, and if you're listening through Apple Podcasts, be sure to leave us a rating and a review. For more from The Stacks, follow us on social media at The Stacks Pod on Instagram and at The Stacks Pod _ on Twitter, and check out our website, thestackspodcast.com. Sebastian Alcala is our sound editor and producer. Our graphic designer is Robin McCrite, and our theme music is from Tegirigis. The Stacks is created and produced by me, Tracy Thomas.
Good afternoon and good night, and welcome to T-Pain's Nappy Boy Radio Podcast, the most fun you'll ever listen to while you're folding your clothes. Now let's get this straight. This is not your average podcast. T-Pain's Nappy Boy Radio is super fun, super crazy. It's pretty much an in-your-face conversation. That's the good thing about us. We don't do interviews. We do conversations. All of my guests, all of my co-hosts, we chill. We drink, we play games, we have the song of the week, we have the creative curse word of the week, as long as you're having fun as our guest. Speaking of guests, each week I'm going to go through my whole contact list and dive head first into the world of music, gaming, exotic cars, tech, strippers probably, doctors probably strippers that are only stripping so they can pay for tuition to become a doctor. You never know. My wife is a certified bartender. She'll make you a drink while you're here. We'll get you drunk and make you play VR after. It's a lot going on. But that's what it's all about over here at T-Pain's Nappy Boy Radio Podcast. See you soon, baby!
Abramarama presents Chasing Childhood, a documentary exploring the unintended consequences of helicopter parenting. In today's world, free play in childhood has all but disappeared, giving way to unprecedented anxiety and depression. In Chasing Childhood, psychologists, activists, and leaders of the free play movement fight for benefits of a less curated childhood. Available on demand now, chasingchildhooddoc.com.